Today's talk is about the Great Trigonometrical Survey, uh, and it's actually linked to a book that was written about this by me and co-authored. My co-author Shruti Rao. Unfortunately, she's not here because she lives in San Francisco. So let's dive into this right away. Let's go back to the late 1700s, and we begin with the question: what is the shape of the Earth? Now, by this time, late 1700s, people have already figured out that it's not really a flat Earth. People have sailed around the Magellan, went around, and he didn't fall off anywhere, which clearly showed that it was not a flat Earth. It was somewhat spherical. So this debate was settled. But when you say spherical, is it really spherical or is it a little oddly shaped? And of course, we all know now that it is a little bit oddly shaped. So if you look at the debate about the exact shape of the Earth in the late 1600s, 1700s, there were two large camps. One believed that the Earth was flattened at the poles. This is Team Grapefruit, led by Newton. And then you had Team Egg, which believed that the Earth was actually flattened at the equator. And this was largely the belief of the French scientists. Now, if we go a little ahead in time, by the late 1700s, even this debate is settled, and we know that it's really like a grapefruit, flattened at the poles. But what about the rest of it? What about the places in the tropics? What about places like India? What really is the shape of the Earth there? How much is it curved? This was a question which was still not answered. And this was a question which greatly interested this gentleman, William Lambton. You've all heard the name. And I think a lot of you have already you guys already know quite a bit about the Great Arc from conversations I've heard. So you know that William Lambton was closely associated with what I'm going to speak about. Now, Lambton was a bit of a nerd. We don't really know too much about him because he was not one to talk about himself. He liked talking about mathematics, he liked talking about surveying, he liked talking about astronomy, but not really so much about himself. Um, he was in the army and he also took part in the battle in 1799 against Tipu Sultan. And I'll give you a little bit of a side story about this battle and Lambton's role in this. It so happened that one day, Lambton was part of a small party that went looking around at night for one of Tipu's small units in the army. And they went blundering about the forest. They went walking around near Srirangapatna. They didn't find any army men, and they decided that they should head back to their camp. So as they were heading back to their camp, Lambton thinks there's something wrong. There's something wrong. He looks at the stars and he realizes that instead of going north, they're going south. Because he knows about the stars. He knows how to tell directions using the stars. So he goes up to his general, who happens to be David Baird. And those of you who know a little bit about Tipu will recognize this name. David Baird is the one who later, eventually, he's the one who led the assault against Tipu and eventually was responsible for Tipu's defeat. So Lambton goes up to David Baird and says, I think we're heading in the wrong direction. And David Baird says, I know all about this. I don't need to look at the stars to tell my way around. And they go ahead, and true enough, they're heading directly into Tipu's camp. So they make a quick turnaround, and then so of course Lambton saved the day that day. But this later led to Tipu's defeat. Now, this was important because with the defeat of Tipu Sultan, basically the entire peninsula is now opened up to the British, right? He practically ruled over all of South India. And so this means that for someone who's interested in drawing maps, in figuring out the shape of the earth, this is really good territory. Because Lambton has this sublime desideratum that he calls. He writes to the East India Company. Now, this is a time when there are maps of the country, there are maps of the subcontinent, but not very accurate ones. So he writes to the people in the EIC, in the East India Company, and he goes on about the importance of maps and how it is important to have accurate maps, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end, he says, there's also this sublime desideratum. I really want to measure the shape of the earth. So the maps convince the people, the directors in the EIC, and they say, fine, go ahead. What Lambton's plan is to draw, quote unquote, draw a line across the peninsula from south to north, and he will measure the distance on the ground and between each degree of latitude. And this way he can figure out the exact curvature of the earth at that point. That's his plan. And how's he going to do this? He's going to do it using triangulation. So we all learn triangulation in school, but for those of you who've forgotten, like me, this is basically dealing with the shape of triangles, right? So if you know the distance AB, if you know that line AB, and you know two of the angles, let's say Y, let's say Z, then you can figure out the distance between a third point, let's say C. You can figure it out without actually having to measure on the ground, right? So this is a property of, it's using trigonometry with sine and cos and all of that. So what this means is measuring just AB, you can figure out the distance AC, you can figure out the distance CB, right? Keep this in mind. What that means is now I can extend. Using the baseline AB, I have figured out the distance CB. Now using that known distance, I can then figure out another distance, CD and BD, and so on and so forth. You get my point? So I use this known distance and I figure out more known distances. How many of these have I actually measured on the ground? Just AB, which is why it's called the baseline, right? That's the one distance I need to measure properly on the ground. The rest of it, I'm just going to use, I'm going to measure points using the angle between this line and that point. I don't actually have to measure on the ground. Okay, so this was Lambton's plan. What do you need to set up a baseline? You need a suitable place. You don't want something, we'll come to this a little bit later. You need a lot of equipment. And I'll speak about this shortly. There's the steel chain, there's boning rods, the theodolite, which again, I'm sure many of you have heard about, thermometers. You need planks, rods, screws, etc., 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 which means you need a lot of people to carry all the stuff. Other than that, you also need, like if you look at the practical parts of it, you need a big party. And because this party is going to be going around the countryside, they need to stay there. It's not like they can go there, measure something, come back home. No, which means they're going to be staying out, which means they need tents and they need all the things that are associated with it. So you have the tent for the office, for the living, you have the tent to store all your equipment, you have an observatory tent, and I'll show you in a bit, and you have a necessary. What's a necessary? Yeah, it's the toilet, right? Yeah. So how exactly do you set up a baseline? This equipment on the right is a steel chain, and this was what was used to draw a straight line over a particular distance. Now, the steel chain that they used was only 100 feet. The baselines that they drew were a lot more than that, which means that they needed to be able to draw properly straight lines. So the image on the left shows you how this is done. Those T-shaped things, those of you who are civil engineers would recognize this. This is what is called a boning rod. And essentially, this was the method that was used by Lambton. But because this is the GTS and setting up the baseline is like a really very, very crucial, because all other measurements are based on this. It has to be extremely accurate. So, which means that it was a little more complicated than what is suggested on the image on the left. So, you would set up the steel chain in wooden boxes. And then once you've measured 100 feet, you would have to take them out of the wooden boxes, move the boxes ahead, and then put them back inside the boxes, and then make sure they're in a straight line, and do this over and over and over again, right? So this image is actually from a later period. This is from the 1830s, by which time the process had changed a little bit. Some of the equipment they were using had changed a little bit. But you get the idea that there is, if you look inside the tents, you can see there's something laid out. And you can see the reason for having it under the tent is because you don't want direct sunlight falling on these things. Why? Because it's steel. With sunlight, it's going to expand, it's going to contract. And then something that is 100 feet will no longer be 100 feet. It'll be a little bit more than 100 feet. And that's not acceptable. So now, despite all of this, of course, steel is going to expand with temperature. And so what they had to do was, along with the steel chain, they had thermometers to measure the temperature and then calculate and see how much has it expanded. So you can imagine for every measurement how long all this would have taken, right? I'm going to come back to this in a minute. Okay, so now once Lambton has convinced his people, his bosses at the East India Company, that he can go ahead with what was then called the Mathematical and Geographical Survey, he begins the trial in Bangalore. Okay, so this started in 1800 and finished, just setting up the baseline, finished a little less than October, November, December, about a little less than 2 months later. Now, the length of the baseline was a little less than 12 kilometers. And you can see it's taken them almost 60 days to measure this. So imagine for yourself measuring 7.4 miles or 12 kilometers using a 100-foot steel chain. So on some days, they would only measure 100 feet. That's it. On some days, they would be doing like 500 feet, some days even 600. So this is why, like, at every point, they have to make sure that it is straight. They have to make sure that they've measured the temperature. For every reading, they take multiple readings so that they can take an average. All of this is what was adding to these delays, right? So not delays, I mean adding to the whole time taken for this. So this baseline that was done in Bangalore is the first ever that Lambton established as part of the Mathematical and Geographical Survey, right? This is where it was. So the southern end was in Haralur and the northern end in Banaswadi. Okay. So there's nothing really left of the baseline there anymore, unfortunately. So now the first step is setting up the baseline. The second step would be what? You need to, once you've established this, you need to figure out what is the point. You're drawing a map, you're pinpointing locations of places on the map, right? So now you come to the second step, which is triangulation. And when you're talking of triangulation, then you're talking about these famous kinds of instruments, the great theodolite, and you can see the size of it. It's like this big and extremely, extremely heavy, around 500 kilograms, which meant that it needed 12 people to carry. And because 12 people carrying it would get tired, you had a second team of 12 people, which means in your survey party, 24 people were just dedicated to carrying this theodolite around, right? Essentially, a theodolite is a telescope which you can, through which you can look at horizontally as well as vertically. You can move it around, but it's full of these fiddly parts. So you have to make sure, so which is why you couldn't have put it on a bullock cart and taken it around. So first of all, the roads then maybe were slightly better than what it is now, but still not good enough to take on a bullock cart. So which is why it had to be lifted around and not put in a cart, because it would rattle, it would shake, parts would move, right? So they had to be really, really careful with this. The theodolite is needed when you're standing at one point on the baseline and you're figuring out the angle from where you're standing with the baseline and some point in the distance, right? So you use this to measure the angles. And a second thing that was used, very important as part of the survey, was the zenith sector, so called because it's like essentially like a vertical telescope. You can use this to look at the stars. Now, why would you want to look at the stars? Because when you can use the positions of the stars in the sky to pinpoint your latitude and longitude. Okay, so one is the distance, but you also want to measure that. You also want to measure the lat long there. So all of these were like these essentially simple but very, very delicate and very heavy instruments. So these were what were used in the, so this was the baseline. Now, from this baseline, one of the first points that they actually cited to was a place that is called Mandapam. In their records, it's called the Mandapam. Any guesses on which place this is? So this is the Kempegowda Tower at Mekri Circle. So this was one of the first points that they cite to. One of the others that is maybe the second point that they cite to is the Bangalore Palace. So you have these, if you look at the notes, if you look at the raw data, then you have so many of these, they'll say north end of the baseline to Mandapam, north end of the baseline to Bangalore Palace, north end of baseline to pagoda. It's not all, no, when they say pagoda, they mean temple. It's not always clear which temple they're talking about. Then north end of baseline to tree, we don't know which tree. Then similarly, north end of baseline to south from south end of baseline to Mandapam, etc., etc., etc. Right? So it goes on. So once this baseline has been drawn, you can see on the right at the bottom the red line, and the purple thing there is the Mandapam, the Kempegowda Tower. So now once they've made this baseline, so initially, like I said, they cite to the Mandapam, they figure out the distance between the Kempegowda Tower and the two ends of the baseline. So now using that distance, they can then kind of jump ahead. So now they're citing to Savandurga, to this Betta Halasuru, which is, that hill when you're going to the airport, which is nearly whittled away. That's one of the hills that they cited to as well. And so on and so forth. So whether it's like 20 kilometers or 30 kilometers, 40, 100 kilometers, they're basically climbing up these high points and then citing from there to another high point. And in this way, this trial of establishing the locations and distances from one place to the other, this trial goes on for more than 1.5 hours. 1.5 years. And eventually, Lambton extends all the way, the triangulation goes all the way up to Srirangapatna, where he establishes another part of the same trial, establishes another baseline. Now, by this time, the superiors at EIC are pretty convinced that, we should go ahead with this. Now, one of the reasons he did this trial was, of course, to figure out methods, but also because he was actually waiting for some equipment from England. So when that comes, then you see the actual official beginning, which is in Chennai. So in Chennai, again, he starts in April 1802. I really don't know why he picked summer, but anyway, I guess in Madras, it doesn't make a difference. So the length of the baseline there was again about 12 kilometers, and the north end was in the racecourse near Gindi, and the south end in Sholinganallur. And many people will say that the first, the baseline was from St. Thomas Mount. It was not. It was actually from the racecourse to Sholinganallur, which is shown here. But just like here, he measured from the baseline to the Mandapam. Similarly, that's what he did there. If you notice, St. Thomas Mount is very close to that on the north end. And you see Perumbakam, there's another hill there, which is very close to the south end of the baseline, right? Now, why did he pick these points? Why did he pick a point in the Madras racecourse? St. Thomas Mount is at 13 degrees latitude, same thing almost as Bangalore. Now, I think what this means is that, now remember, he wanted to draw a line across the peninsula, right? Which means he has to go from Kanyakumari all the way up north, and that line is going to pass through Bangalore, right? So this is why he picks like a latitude which is around the same as Bangalore's, because eventually he's also going to triangulate from coast to coast. So that way, Bangalore is central, and therefore Madras is picked because Fort St. George is there. There's already an observatory there. They know the exact location of that observatory. Lat long and all is accepted. So all these reasons, yes, but why particularly this race course, and why St. Thomas Mount? Why not something a little further south, a little further north? Because it was on the 13th degree, right? That's why. So this was the baseline that he did. And like I said, he cites to St. Thomas Mount, he cites to Perumbakam Hill. Now, and of course, this means he can figure out the distance between St. Thomas Mount and Perumbakam Hill. Um, and Lambton being Lambton, he just needed to draw one triangle, right? He just needed to do maybe like one set of sightings, but that's not what he does. He does all permutations, combinations. He sights from the north end to Perambakam, and from south end to Perambakam, then from south end to Thomas Mount, etc., etc. So he gets this set of triangles so that he can cross check to see how his calculation errors are, how his measurement of the angles are, how's it going. And as you can see, what he figures out is that over a distance of about 13 kilometers, which is from St. Thomas Mount to Perambakam Hill, the calculated distance is just about 3 centimeters different. The difference between these various calculations is just 3 centimeters, which is pretty small. So this line, St. Thomas Mount to Perambakam Hill, especially St. Thomas Mount, especially this line, this then forms the basis for further triangulations across the peninsula. So he triangulates all the way. You can see like there are these large triangles going all over the place. And there are some names here which are, so this is like in the early 1800s, and the British aren't really able to pronounce the names very well at all. They can't pronounce it even now. But anyway, then it was even worse. So sometimes the names are like, there's one name, it says like Banargetta, what they call it? Bonairgetta. So it's quite amusing. Anyway, so they triangulate all the way to Bangalore. And at Bangalore, he sets up a second baseline. He does not use the trial baseline that he had established earlier. He sets up a second baseline in 1804. And here again, just look at the emphasis on accuracy, right? So because he's so finicky about measuring as precisely as possible, the distance between these two baselines, 280 kilometers, right? And he actually calculates the distance. And you see that the difference is actually just 10 centimeters over a distance of 280 kilometers. So that gives you an idea of the kind of accuracy he was aiming for and generally managed as well. So this is the coast-to-coast triangulation that he does from Madras to, from Madras all the way across to the other end of to the western coast at Bangalore. And this leads to kind of like a proof of concept, because through this triangulation, he's able to establish that where earlier maps that the British had made showed the distance between Madras and Bangalore was actually a lot less than what earlier maps had shown. So this was like one of the, it's a commonly told joke is that this was like the greatest loss of territory that the EIC ever experienced. So he triangulates from Madras to Bangalore. Then he goes down south from Kanyakumari and he triangulates his way up. And eventually, this is what the eventual map of the GTS looks like. It's just this network of triangles which is thrown almost all over the country. So, and here we have like the central one, which is going from Kanyakumari all the way to the Himalayas. This is what is known as the Great Arc, because this is the principal line along which Lambton wants to measure the distance between latitudes to figure out the shape of the Earth. Because remember, he had two objectives: to draw maps and to figure out the shape of the Earth. So now Lambton dies somewhere in, like, while they are around halfway up this great arc, measuring along the central spine. And the person whom he designates as his successor is George Everest. And you couldn't have come up with two more different people. So Lambton, remember I said he hardly ever liked to talk about himself. He was always like happiest behind a telescope. Everest, on the other hand, wow. So he's like just as focused as Lambton was, very focused on the Great Arc, very focused on on getting this triangulation done, etc. But where, like, he also had this huge ego. So you could not just call him George Everest. You had to call him later, when he becomes Surveyor General, you had to call him Surveyor General Bahadur Sahib. Otherwise, he'd be all offended. So, and incidentally, Okay, I'll come to this later. Yeah. So, although very, very different in personality, definitely a worthy successor to Lambton because, like I said, he was totally focused and he introduced a lot of innovations. So, now when Lambton was working on the GTS, when he was leading the team, they would they would usually prefer doing their work during the monsoons because the rest of the time there was always this haze. You couldn't really sight. You're sitting up on Savandurga Hill, for example, and you're looking for something which is several kilometers away. You couldn't always see it. Whereas in the monsoon, the dust settles and then you can see it. But of course, the monsoon comes with its own huge set of hurdles. And in fact, like when Everest first joined the survey, that was his first baptism because like he was sent by Lambton to survey along the Krishna Godavari. It was the monsoon, it was this jungle, and he fell ill several times. He got malaria. He never actually recovered. There were times when he had to be held up. People had to hold him up so that he could actually look through the theodolite, but he used to still persevere. So Everest introduced some innovations. One thing that he did was he introduced nighttime surveying, which meant now you didn't have to wait for the monsoon. You could actually, so you could do your work throughout the year, basically, because he came up with these very simple solutions, basically using like a diya, like a large diya, if you imagine, with, like for Deepavali, sometimes we'll put a pot over it so it doesn't, the wind doesn't turn it off. It's basically that. So he would have people who would go to the point that was to be sighted, and he would have them light a lamp, and then they have to wait. And meantime, from here, somebody would be sighting. So this kind of thing really sped up the survey, and it also reduced casualties because it meant you didn't have to wait for the monsoon. So this was something quite innovative on his part. He also introduced a recipe for blue lights because when you're looking for something at night, it's easier to sight on a lamp. Now, on a light, sometimes these diya type things would go off. So he introduced a flare. Now, flares had been used even before Everest's times, but Everest introduced a particular formula with like 70 plus ingredients and all of this, and it had to be made just so that it wouldn't explode and injure the person and all of that. But again, this was something that sped up the whole survey. And now, by the time Everest joins, the technology has changed, and so you're no longer using the steel bars like earlier. You're using something called compensation bars, um, which are made so that there is no expansion and contraction despite the temperature. It's like a mix of two metals and so on and so forth. So all of these things were being done. And I can speak a little bit more about it afterwards in the Q&A if you have any questions about it. So Everest, during his time, the arc just like forged ahead, and he was able to get it all the way up to Dehradun. Right now, in the meantime, because the one part of the survey is, of course, making maps, there are also these other arms along India, which you saw on the map, where triangulation is also taking place. Right. So after Everest, you have Andrew Waugh, who takes over as Surveyor General of India, and by his time, now it's like the work is going on, a lot of the work is going on in the Himalayas. Now, Everest was not really bothered about the Himalayas. He was, like I said, focused on the arc. But Andrew Waugh was very interested in the Himalayas. As you're surveying, you see these mountains on the left, on your, on the horizon. So, of course, they sighted them. And at that time, incredible as it seems to us today, nobody knew which the tallest mountain in the world was. And the biggest contender for tallest mountain in the world, many people believed that it was somewhere in the Andes, which today seems laughable, but that was what it was then. So there were people who thought that it's not in the Andes, it's in the Himalayas, but it was not really, I mean, it was hotly contested. Now, there was one peak, which, like all these peaks were given these names. There's peak 21, peak 22, peak 15, etc. This particular one is peak 15. Now, when you're um, citing these mountains, there were some issues then. So this was a time when surveyors were not really allowed into Nepal, nor were they allowed into Tibet, which meant they really couldn't get any closer to the mountains. They had to sight from 150 kilometers away, which means like somewhere in Bihar, northern parts of Bihar. From here, they would look at the mountains. Now, anybody who's been mountaineering would know that this is like incredibly difficult. There are days, weeks, months together when you can't see the mountain at all. And then when you do see them, sometimes it'll appear early in the morning and then it's gone because of the, and then there'll be like these snowy drafts and you don't know, is it snow or is it the mountain, or it'll just be obscured. There were all these practical problems, right? But with all this, so first, one of the peaks that they determined the height of was Nanda Devi, and they found that the height of that is 25,000 something. And immediately you know that, okay, that means it's no longer in the Andes. Maybe it's Nanda Devi, which is the highest mountain in the world. Then shortly after that, they cite Kanchenjunga. And this is, I think, around 28,000 or so, which means, okay, it's not Nanda Devi. Maybe Kanchenjunga is the highest mountain in the world. But War sees this mountain, which you can see kind of behind these. There's this mountain which is peeking out, and he thinks peak 15, that's the one. So peak 15, also called Gamma initially, they have 6 sightings of it from different places. And it was not such an easy matter as just averaging the height and saying, okay, this is it. No, because they had to figure out refraction, they had to figure out where is elevation 0. All of these complications were there. So, and when you're saying, if you're going to say that this is indeed the highest mountain in the world, you'd better be sure. So the job of calculating went to Radhanath Sikdar. So Sikdar was again this mathematical genius who, so when he joined school, Hindu college, his father thought, okay, I'll put him in college. He was about 11 when he joined that college, and his father thought he'll learn a little bit of English, he'll learn a little bit of maths, and maybe Sanskrit or something, and he'll get a job as a clerk. So of course, Sikdar did like much more than that. And I've mentioned Henry Vivien de Rosio because Sikdar was one of the people who was incredibly influenced. Like Henry de Rosio had this gang of people that he was who worked with him very closely, or who not worked with him, but who were highly influenced by him. Sikdar was one of them. So his mathematical genius was kind of recognized, his acumen was kind of recognized, and one of his professors recommended that he join the survey work. And so he joined the work as what is called a chief computer, which just meant that it was his job to handle all these calculations. And it was he who eventually figured out the height of of peak 15. And once he had sent his results to War, then War wanted to double check that. So another several months went off as a second team double checked the calculations of Sikdar. And of course, it was all correct. And it was only then that War announced that peak 15, aka Mount Everest, was the highest mountain in the world. There are 2 stories related to this episode. One says that Sikdar burst into War's office and he said, I have discovered the highest mountain in the world. It's Mount Everest. No, it didn't really happen like that. And there's a second story which is told that, so now the height that was announced was 29,002 feet. And many people will say that actually it was 29,000 feet that they calculated, but they thought that if they say 29,000 feet, people will not believe it. And so they added on the 2. Now, let me ask you, we've been speaking so much about accuracy, precision, blah, blah. You really think they would do this? No, they didn't. So 29,002 was what was determined to be the height, and that was what was announced. Now, there's also this story about, so it was War who named the mountain as Mount Everest. Everest himself was not at all in favor of naming it after himself, because for one thing, he believed that it should be given the local name wherever possible. So Sagarmatha maybe, or Chomolungma, whatever. The second thing was he thought that people wouldn't be able to pronounce his name because I'm saying Everest, but that's not how he pronounced his name. He pronounced it Everest. Everest, right? So the irony is that despite his objections, it was named Mount Everest and we continue to call it Everest. Anyway, so apart from, so we've spoken about Lambton, about Everest. There were, of course, several Indians who were also involved in this. Sikdar is one of the most famous ones. There were others as well who worked in various capacities. And one of my favorite stories is about this gentleman called Syed Mir Mohsin, who began his career in Arcot. And he was working in this jewelry shop one day. And when he was working there, some of the officers from a nearby military encampment, they come to his shop and they tell the owner of the shop, we have this equipment. We don't have the budget to send this equipment back to England to get it fixed. So you guys work with fine instruments and you're used to fine work with your hands. So do you think you all could take a look at this instrument and fix it for us? Now, we don't know exactly what instrument it was, but Mohsin is called to take a look at the instrument. And it's probably the first time he's seeing something like that, but he manages to fix it. So then a relationship develops. Anytime they need some work being done, any work done on their instruments in the military encampment, they send it over to Mohsin and he works on it. And eventually, when the head of this military encampment, his name was Valentine Blacker, when he goes to the survey offices in Calcutta, he takes Mohsin along with him. And that's how Mohsin joins the survey. And eventually he is made the mathematical instrument maker. That's actually a title. And he's the first Indian to hold this post. Before him, there was a gentleman called Barrow, who Everest had brought out from England just for this purpose. So there was an incident once when Everest needed some work done on two what were called astronomical circles. And he gave the job to Barrow. And Barrow says, yes, I'll do it. And he says, yes, I'll do it. And months are passing. And then eventually Barrow says, you know what, I can't do it. So Everest, of course, fires him and he gets in Mohsin. And Mohsin works on it and he fixes it. So Everest is so pleased, he actually writes a paper about how this is done. So anyway, that was Mohsin, who today, I think, like if Mohsin was around today, we would probably call him an instrumentation engineer. But yeah, he was actually not. He was actually also not formally educated, but nonetheless an inventor. My background, I did my master's I did my PhD in forest ecology. And one of the things we used is an instrument to determine the height of trees. And in other places in the world, this is often called the Brandis hypsometer. Who's this Brandis? Dietrich Brandis is the father of Indian forestry. He was a German gentleman. And he is the one who is credited with inventing an instrument that helps you determine the height of trees in different kinds of terrain. Now, where am I going with this? Because when Mohsin was in Calcutta, Dietrich Brandis once happens to meet him after Mohsin has retired from the survey. And they get talking, and Brandis says, I'm finding it really difficult to work in this tough terrain in Burma where I can't use my instrument to figure out the height of trees. It's really tough. And Mohsin says, I can fix this. And so they work together and he makes this thing called the hypsometer. And then eventually, after he dies, Brandis applies for a patent and it gets known as the Brandis hypsometer. Anyway, so besides Mohsin, there were, of course, besides Sikdar and Mohsin, there were many, many, many other Indians in the GTS, several of them, many of whom we don't know. But besides the people who worked on the instruments and the actual calculations, etc., there were also the support staff, right? So there were the porters I mentioned, who were needed to carry so many of the things. There were runners, because how do you get your messages from one place to another? Let's say you're stuck in the forest, you're measuring something in Madhya Pradesh. your survey office is in Calcutta. How do you get the message across? You have runners who would do this for you. And you had to have soldiers and guards. Why? One is, of course, robbery. There were other complications as well. So imagine this team of, these survey parties, like I've said, they could be really huge. They could be anything from 100 to 650, 700 people. There'd be horses, there'd be Everest used to also have elephants, depending on where he was going. It was like an army. And we're talking about a time in the early 1800s where, especially in northern parts of the country, there was a lot of unrest politically. And so imagine this team of Europeans and Indians who troop into your village with horses and strange looking instruments and all that. People were very uncomfortable about this. So they would be hostile towards it. It was not uncommon for them, for the survey party, to be attacked. So there were soldiers and guards for that reason as well, not just because of the burglary. And of course, there were other, carpenters, cooks, and khalasis. What are khalasis? With respect to the survey, a khalasi was also a very, very important part of the party. So a khalasi's job would be almost like sometimes like a flagman, which means you would send the khalasi, sometimes just one person, sometimes, a party of 2 or 3, a small party maybe. You see, the surveyors are in one point, you want to sight to the next point, you will send the khalasi off to that place. Now imagine, sometimes you're in the middle of a forest, you're in some hilly terrain. You have to hack your way through the forest. You have to get to that mountain on top. You have to brave the wild animals. And then you have to sit there with a lamp. And Everest would be extremely unhappy if you fell asleep holding that lamp. And so you have to stay awake at nights. Sometimes you're there all alone for like weeks because maybe conditions are not right for sighting. It has to be just right. You would hear the wild animals. Sometimes it's just you. Sometimes it's 2 people. So these were very important people in the survey, and Everest also recognized this. So he would object if people call them coolies. No, they were khalasis. They were respected people. Unfortunately, we don't know the names or stories of most of them. Now, besides these, some of you, I'm sure, would have heard also of the Pandits. The Pandits were surveyors as well, but they were not part of the trigonometrical survey, which is why we have not really spoken too much about. We have not spoken about them in our book at all. But if you want, I can tell you the story afterwards if you have questions about it. But very, very interesting people. So this is just an image, just to give you an idea. This is not a GTS party. This is actually like a revenue survey. As I said, the GTS party, they would be carrying much larger instruments. It would be just like a wholly larger enterprise, right? So that's like an overview of the GTS. This all happened more than 100 years ago. So it began in 1800s in Bangalore, officially in 1802. Some people will say it ended in 1870. But no, it actually continued beyond that. Even in the early 1900s, you still find papers and things being published about triangulation in different parts of the country. So all this happened like more than 100 years ago. Is there something remaining for us to see? Yes, of course, there's a lot. So there's in Bangalore, because this is where we started, this is where we are, there are remnants of the baselines, and there's a lot of other stuff that you can see as well, not just in Bangalore, elsewhere around the country. So again, I think many of you would have seen this. Do you recognize the one on the right? No. Yeah. So you can see that somebody has painted that circle in the middle, and below that there is this thing called BM, which means benchmark. But whoever painted it has forgotten to paint, or has not seen that above that yellow, very faintly, you can see GTS, right? So that's the Great Trigonometrical Survey. The one on the left, the GTS benchmark in Indiranagar, it's on a water trough, which is on Old Madras Road. So anytime you happen to be there, just stop by and take a look at it. So they turn up in like the most unexpected places. There are several of them in Bangalore. I showed you the Kempegowda Tower. On that itself, there are quite a few. Queen Victoria statue has one. There used to be GTS benchmarks in St. Mark's Church, in St. Andrew's Church, and several other places. Now, why did they pick these? Because these were places that they thought would last, would survive. Of course, the reality is they didn't. So there is one benchmark I saw a few years ago. I don't know if it is still there. It was in the Kadagodi railway station, just next to the toilet. So if somebody happens to go there and see it, please let me know. There are outside Bangalore. I've seen them on sluice gates. There are on the steps leading to temples. Several, and like I said, any place where the surveyors felt would the mark would survive. What are these benchmarks for? These benchmarks are places where these would be published as, giving the exact location. And these are places where the elevation was precisely known. So the whole point of a benchmark like this is even today, when a surveyor wants to say lay out a canal and they need to know the elevation, they will look for a GTS benchmark and then start their surveys from there, because this is an accurately known elevation point. Okay, so I've included this. It's a bit of a stretch, but you all recognize this, right? This is the big temple, the Brihadeshwara temple in Tanjore. And again, this is a very, many of you would have heard the story about how when Lambton and Party were surveying in that area, see, when you're surveying, it's very convenient if you have a high point, which is why around Bangalore, Nandi Hills, Savandurga, you name it, any hillock, they would have gone there and surveyed, for sure. But like I mentioned, even in these areas, among other things that they cited were the Nanjangud temple, for example, the Ranganatha Swami temple in Srirangapatna, etc., etc. Now, we don't know whether they climbed all of these. We don't know if they climbed the Gopura and all of these. In some places, it looks like they did. In some places, it looks like they actually just came up to like the platform of the temple, like in the Hoysala temple, you'll have a platform. In some places, you have a platform like that. When they go to Tanjore, no hills, but there are all these temples. And there's this Brihadeshwara temple, which is like 60-meter high Vimana. So, of course, this was what they wanted to use. And so they haul the theodolite, that 500 kilogram theodolite, they haul it up the Vimana. And at one point, the rope snaps and the theodolite crashes into the tower. So, of course, the theodolite is damaged, and it takes Lambton 6 weeks or so to fix it. But the temple is also damaged. So stone sculpture with that 500 kg dhram when it falls, of course, it got damaged. So now in the Brihadeshwara, at one point, you see this rather unusual sculpture. It's clearly not a deity. He's wearing a hat. There are some people who say this is Marco Polo. Could be, maybe, but it's also possible. Is it also possible? It's a question. Is it also possible this is a surveyor? Was this the point where the theodolite got, damaged the tower, and was this a replacement? Question mark. So when we come to baselines, what else can we see? Baselines, I spoke about the baseline in Bangalore, in Chennai. It's not like they were drawing baselines all over, there weren't that many of them. This is the entire list of baselines that was drawn, that was established during the 100-year period of the GTS. And in many of these, there is no trace left of it anymore at all. Like in Bidar, there's nothing. In Guntur, to the best of my knowledge, there's nothing, right? This is how, now this kind of survey work was also had started a little bit earlier in England. And in fact, the survey in England was the inspiration for the survey in India for Lambton. In England, this is how they marked the ends of the baseline. They would take a cannon and they would stick it muzzle down they would stick the back end down into the ground. And so just a few feet of it are seen above ground. So this is quite exciting. This is not what we did here. In some places, like on the right, this is a baseline tower in Calcutta, and it's actually in the city. You have both ends of the baseline marked by a tower, and on the tower there is this modern explanation that this is part of the GTS. but for a while there used to be an advertisement for Borolene. So this was called the Borolene Tower. So on the left, you have these other towers, which were not really baseline towers, but these were used for sighting. So when we're in the Bangalore region, there's hills everywhere, or there are these temples very conveniently located. What do you do in a place where there's nothing like that? There's forest as far as you can see. So initially, this was all Everest's um, period. And so he tries building these bamboo towers, which are very rickety. So you build a bamboo tower, which is like 50 feet, 60 feet high, and then you have to carry that theodolite up, and then people have to climb up there. And then when the wind blows, the theodolite is moving, people are moving, and it's like, not only is it dangerous, it's also like it's not amenable to proper measurements. So this was not a good idea at all. So one thing that they did in some areas was to use these visual telegraph towers. So visual telegraph was the system of experimental system that was tried by the EIC, by the East India Company, to carry messages from one place to another, essentially like a semaphore. So this system was tried and abandoned, but the towers were still there. So wherever possible, they would use that. If not, they started building these towers. So especially in the Eastern India, you do see some of these towers still standing. In Bangalore, this is one of the stations that you can still see. This is what's called an auxiliary station. I showed you the baseline from north to south. Just for greater accuracy, what they also would do later on was to have these intermediate stations, which were flanking the baselines on both sides. And the thing at Sampigehalli was one such. So this looks very, very unprepossessing. It was not always like this. If you climb up there, what you see is this platform of stones. And if you climb up onto the platform, you'll see this cavity in the center. And there used to be a pillar there. So this was how they used to mark the baselines and principal stations in many of the places. So there are remains of these kind of stations. I've already mentioned Savandurga. It's still there. You can actually still see that. Also in Banarghetta, you can still see it. This is, again, coming back to near the Kempegowda Tower. So I mentioned the first baseline in Bangalore, experimental, the trial. I mentioned from Madras, when they come triangulating all the way, he draws a second baseline in 1804. Now, and I also mentioned that by the time of Everest, technology has changed. They're using new equipment, and Everest says all those old baselines, we can't use them anymore. We have to redo everything. So from the after Everest's time, this work continues in the 1850s, 1860s. They re-establish baselines in many places, including Bangalore. So in 1868, they drew a third baseline in Bangalore. And this was the southeastern end of the baseline. It didn't always look like this. It would have looked like this. So there would have been an observatory tower. That structure was demolished sometime in 1937, and this was put in its place instead. The northeastern end of the Bangalore baseline, the third Bangalore baseline, is this. And it's this very cute little structure, very small. And this would have been, okay, so some years ago, in this picture, you will see this, that's me next to the building, and in front of me is this lady called Almitra Patel. And she was the one who first showed me this structure way back in 2010 or so. And she said it's part of a survey. And then, after, like when she mentioned this, then I got interested in like what survey, what was this all about? And that's how I first came upon the Great Trigonometrical Survey. Anyway, so this baseline, this observatory tower was actually in pretty bad shape. As you can see, there were major cracks, structural cracks on it. So as part of, so I belong to this organization. I volunteer with an organization called INTAC, right? International Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. We had undertaken to restore the structure. So we got the whole place mapped. We documented the structure in great detail. This is what the structure was like inside. Again, you see this little pit. And in that pit, a few feet down, would be a stone with probably a brass plug marking the exact point where the northeastern baseline was, the exact northeastern point. It's probably still there. And this pit was because they would place a pillar in that, and on that place the theodolite. So on top, directly above that pit, on the first floor, there is a stone. This was what it was like earlier. We cleaned up the whole area, and you can see that marking on it, that cross mark. That cross mark corresponds exactly with the point in the ground floor below. So all this was done. We restored the structure. We put up these signs to say what this is all about, the trigonometrical survey, blah, blah, all of this, all of this. This is what happened last year. When we had just about, we'd almost finished writing the book. We hadn't yet finished. So somebody claimed that that land was his private land, which is of course not true. And he brought in a JCB and he demolished the structure. The silver lining in this is that there's two silver linings. One is we heard from people that actually there were local people who objected when he said that he was going to do this. They said, no, you can't. There is this historic monument here. You shouldn't be doing it, which I thought is like good. At least people try to stop it. And the other very big silver lining is that the government of Karnataka is actually interested in restoring the structure. And I really hope that happens. We're working on that. So I will, shameless plug for the book. So this was, so my co-author Shruti and I have written a book about the trigonometrical survey, largely targeting children. So explaining concepts very easily, but also talking about the Indians, which I think their story had not been told enough, and also talking about the actual nitty-gritty of the survey, like exactly how do you draw a baseline. So, and there's also activities for for kids who might be interested. Thank you.
There is a 0 mile in Nagpur. Does it have any relevance to GTS?
No. So next to that 0 milestone, there is actually a small structure which says GTS benchmark. But those kind of things you see in several places around the country. So the benchmark I showed you with GTS and a circle and BM, there were different kinds that were done at different times. So the one that you see in Nagpur is like a small pyramid kind of structure, pyramidical pillar, small thing. So that 0 milestone is really not linked to the GTS, despite the popular story that it is. It's not.
Just an addition. In 1798, the India's first technical institute was established in Chennai, Madras. School of Survey in 1798, only to coordinate all this GTS survey. And that institute went on to become College of Engineering, Indy. Then that went on to be called as Anna University, which is one of the most reputed engineering institutions in the world.
Okay.
One of the earliest engineering colleges in India also. College of Engineering, Indy.
I just want to, I know I've done some survey myself, small ones, and the kind of theodolites being shown in your photographs are really enormous. We've used theodolites which are almost this size. Quite precise now, but this is amazing. 500 kilogram theodolites. I don't know how they're doing it, really seriously. And the calculations also are so complicated.
Yes.
That we used to use calculators and computers, and still I don't know how they did it by hand.
So they use log tables, and
log tables fine, but still,
it's true. It's true. I'm not denying that. Even the log tables, like the log tables that probably many of you have used in school, were not the kind of log tables they use there, because they would use 7-figure logs.
7-figure log tables. But it's so pretty complicated. I can imagine. It is.
Yes.
And they did it with great accuracy. I was wondering whether this kind of exercise for such a large area, like at such diverse area like our country, how was it? What was the experience doing it elsewhere? Like, for example, China, America, they're huge continents. How much time? Because this is great accuracy we did. There must be some great work done there also in China, for example, or maybe in Africa. I was wondering.
Unfortunately, I'm not aware of how it was done in China or Africa, but I do know it was happening in Europe. And one of the long, similar to the Great Arc here, one of the longer measurements, which runs across several countries like Hungary and a few other countries in Europe, those sites are actually now World Heritage Sites. And this great theodolite that you mentioned, the one that Lambton used here initially, so there weren't that many of those instruments made. So some scholars believe there were only 3, but I think there were actually 5 such instruments made in those days. After that, of course, they started making smaller and more compact things. But yeah, these were really difficult ones to handle.
So my question is, for all these particular points, all the points in GTS, did they measure the lat and long as well? Or was it only measured in the places where they use the zenith thing?
That's a good question. In many of these places they did, but not at each and every point. No. So they would, like if you look at their notes, then in many places you will see that they measure, they will say distance from say A to B, but then they measure the lat long in 3 places along the way. So on the Great Arc, they take particular care for measuring the lat long, because that was obviously the crucial for the figuring out the ellipsis, the the shape of the Earth. Yeah.
So I have a question. How many years did it take to build? Did it take to draw the map?
Yeah. So the map, one of the maps that I showed you in between, which shows a whole bunch of triangles across the subcontinent. That particular map is from 1870. But like I said, they were actually still working out and they were still fanning out. So there were GTS people, there were surveyors working in Northeast India. They were working also in some parts of Burma and so on and so forth. So they were still drawing the map even 100 years after it started. By which I mean they were refining, making it more accurate. Yeah.
Hi, my question's kind of inspired because when you said Tibet and Nepal didn't allow them into their territories to do it. So especially the Great Arc goes through quite a few kingdoms, right? Bhopal and Gwalior. How did these guys actually negotiate with all these kingdoms to do it? Is there any data on that?
There's not a whole lot about what was happening in the early 1800s, but obviously this work was still going on during the First War of Independence, what we earlier used to call the Sepoy Mutiny. So during that time, so in the 1850s, 1855, etc., they were already surveying parts of Kashmir. And in Kashmir, so now one party, there were other parties elsewhere. So when this 1857 mutiny started, then a lot of the men, because many of these people were in the army, they were sent off to the siege here and the siege there and so on and so forth. So the number of people who were working in the survey parties actually reduced. And the money also reduced because there was so much military expenditure elsewhere from, by the EIC. So in Kashmir in particular, it's that part of the survey there was actually funded by the Maharaja. But to elaborate on that question, I mentioned earlier how sometimes people were not very, they were very suspicious, the local people, not the rulers. Some of their reactions, in addition to hostility and suspicion, here's a survey party that's going up and sticking up a flag. A flag is like a really potent symbol. So this would rile the feathers of many of the chieftains. And so then at one point, Lambton says, okay, we won't use a flag, we'll use a basket. But, it's still, they had to negotiate their way across all these situations. Sorry. Yeah.
Ma'am, where is the zero milestone in Bangalore?
I'm not very sure.
I, in fact, tried searching for it a long time. Couldn't find out any place.
In many other places, it's near the post office, but then I can't.
It's not yet in the
Yeah.
post office.
Yeah.
Yeah, my initial question was regarding the zero milestone, but I'm not going to ask that. So a little, a little off track, not off track really. You mentioned in one of your slides, Pandits, they are also acting as a surveyor, but they're not those trigonometrical survey. So what is that interesting story behind the Pandits?
So the Pandits were, so I mentioned that Nepal, Tibet, and many of these areas were not accessible to the British, and they were not accessible to many Indians as well. Those areas, like the Kingdom of Nepal, for instance, they had barred anyone except Buddhist pilgrims. So there was one, I think Captain Montgomery was his name. He thought up this idea that he was going to train surveyors to pretend to be priests and then do the surveying. So they would carry these people. For instance, one of the most famous one, but not the first, was a man called Nain Singh. Actually, one of the first so-called Pandits was a man called Abdul Hamid, and he surveyed in parts of Leh and all. But the second or third was Nain Singh, and he used to be a teacher in his village, which was in Uttarakhand, and hence the name Pandit. So they used to train these people to walk a very measured gait, 66 centimeters or so exactly. Whether you're running from a tiger or whether you're climbing a hill or whether you're sauntering, your gait has to be the same. Okay, one particular length. So this was one. They would carry rosaries. All pilgrims carry rosaries, but where other pilgrims carry 108 beads, theirs were 100 beads. And every 10th bead would be larger for them to, so it's easy to count. So as they're walking, they're turning the rosary, and so they're keeping track of the distance, right? So this is one aspect. And all of this had to be done clandestinely. They were pretending to be anything but surveyors. So sometimes Nain Singh particularly, sometimes he would come across a group of traders. So there were these traders, for this kind of cross Himalayan trade used to happen quite a bit until it was stopped in the 1900s, much later. So he would join the group of traders, and they would say, "I'm from Himachal." He said, "Yeah, I'm also from Himachal. Yeah, I will go." So he will join them up to a point, and then he'll come across a group of Buddhist pilgrims going to meet the Panchen Lama. Yeah, I'm also Buddhist pilgrim. He'll join them, and all the while he's surveying. And now, especially when you're donning the robes of a pilgrim, the other one, they'd carry a prayer wheel. So Nain Singh also would carry a prayer wheel, and his prayer wheel. So the idea is you'll keep turning this, right? And in a regular Buddhist prayer wheel, inside there would be a slip of paper with prayers, so that as you're rotating this, the prayers are being sent out. But in the surveyors' prayer wheels, inside there'd be these tightly coiled strips of paper. So you would count, and when you get back to your camp, you'd quickly take out the paper, write down whatever you noted, whatever steps you took, and all of this. So this was their way of storing information. And this work was actually incredibly dangerous, because if they found out, if the authorities in Nepal or Tibet or some of these other places found out that you were a surveyor, you would be banished and or killed. And this has happened. So there were a couple of places where some of the surveyors were, the authorities got suspicious about, so they would go to, okay, let's come back to Nain Singh. I'll tell you the story of when he went to meet the Panchen Lama. So he's going with these pilgrims, and the pilgrims say, "We're going to go meet the Panchen Lama now." Nain Singh becomes very nervous, because he says, "The Panchen Lama, he's this holy man. What if he sees me, and right away he'll see through my disguise and he'll know that I'm a fraud? What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" But he can't refuse, because he's claimed to be a Buddhist pilgrim. Then why would he refuse? That'll be suspicious. So there's no choice. He has to go. So he goes, and like when you're in a queue, say for an injection, you don't want to be in front, you'll keep going back. He does this, he goes back, and he sees that first he goes in, and when he watches people go in, and he sees first thing, Panchen Lama is only a child, around 11. So, okay, that's a big thing. Okay, relief. And then he watches that the Panchen Lama is asking people just 3 questions, same questions everywhere. Where are you from? How's your health? I hope things are okay. So, fine, I can deal with this. So he goes and he comes out. So there are these little stories about Nain Singh, who rightly is the most famous of the Pandits, because he surveyed many of these places. So Nain Singh's cousin, Mani also was a surveyor, not quite as he didn't do as much of surveying as Nain Singh, but there were a bunch of these people who were part of this survey thing. They would also carry. Sorry, I'm just going on, yeah. So, we can talk about this later. So I'll take some other questions if you have any. Yeah, and yeah. So they would, this way they found out, for instance, like the exact point where some of the rivers bend, the origins of some of the rivers, all of these things. And in some places, they also had to, you want to see, like, you want to do a little bit of sighting using a compass. It's good to have like a mirror base sometimes when you have when you're using a compass, using a particular kind of compass. What did they do for this? They would carry coconuts filled with mercury. Okay, so you're carrying a coconut shirt, pilgrim, coconut, fine. But your coconut, when you open it, there's mercury. And so the mercury would be the surface on which they would sight. So there were all these incredibly interesting details about how they managed all this.
Hi. So, how difficult was it to collect all this information, like to write this book and to give this talk? I'm just wondering, like, how long did it take? Like,
so the actual writing. So I worked with Shruti Rao, who she lives in San Francisco, and possibly that's why it took us about, I would say, maybe 6 or 7 months, because what would happen is I would write during my day, and Shruti would write during her day. So effectively, we were writing 24 hours. But so the writing itself took around that much time. But for both Shruti and I, this idea about the GTS had been brewing in our minds for a very long time. How difficult was it to come across gather the information? It's there in a lot of different places, and there are a lot of red herrings along the way, which you have to discard, and you have to go to the archival information, the archival documents, so you can actually read Lambton's actual reports. You can read some of the Survey of India itself has also published a lot of its archival documents, and many of the stories are there. A lot of the information is there. Understanding, actually, because they were not writing for people like us to understand, they were writing for their peers, and so understanding exactly, really, how did you draw that line, that took some time. Understanding this process actually took some time.
Very fascinating stories, Meera. I'm just reminded of something that I read long time ago, where a ship was captured by French that had a theodolite.
Yeah.
And they kind of dismantle it and figure out, oh, this is a theodolite, and they figure out this for the GTS. So they pack it back and they send a note along with it and say, best of luck, you're doing something great.
Yeah.
Right?
So that's Lambton's theodolite.
That's Lambton's theodolite. Right?
Yeah.
So that's how it showed that they were arch enemies at the turn of 18th century, but then they thought this was some equipment that was going for a war, right? I mean, it could be helping them to destroy them, and then this kind of pack it back and send it. So it looks at how the science drove some of these steps forward between French and the English on.
Yep.
So just want to kind of bring that up.
I think many of you who are interested in this have probably already read the book by John Key, which is called The Great Arc. It's a wonderful book, and I would highly recommend it. And it has a lot of details about the GTS and a little bit about Lambton and Everest, and a lot about Everest actually. I would, highly recommend that. It does not have someone asked me the other day, like, so is your book any different from it? Yes, of course, because first it's targeting children, and two is it's talking a lot about the Indians, which John Key doesn't. Yeah. So I was reminded of this book because the story that Sir mentioned is also included in John Key's book. Yeah.
I had the same question about the process of writing the book, but maybe just one small addition is you said it specifically captures stories of Indians. Is that also well documented, or was that sort of hard to put together?
It's not that well documented, no.
I have a question about the nitty-gritty science of it all. I feel like there's something I'm failing to understand. I know how trigonometry works, but I guess it's how the instruments are working. They sight a point on a tall mountain. Sure, you can see it, but like, then what? They like point this instrument at it. Can we have a little bit more detail about how that measurement is made?
Okay. So let's take the north end of the baseline in Bangalore up and the south end of the baseline and the Kempegowda Tower. So you'll stand at the north end of the baseline, say Banaswadi, and you can see the Kempegowda Tower. So you will use your theodolite. At that time, they didn't actually have the great theodolite. That came a little later when they started the work in Chennai. But let's assume, okay, some theodolite. So you will zero your theodolite, okay? And so you will get the angle between this baseline all the way up to the Kempegowda Tower. So you have now one side and you have one angle, okay, in a triangle. The next, you will go down to your south end of the baseline, and from there you'll do the same thing. You will zero the theodolite and you'll get the angle between the baseline and the mandapam, the same point, right? So now you have two angles. You have the side, you have the baseline, you know the length of the baseline. You have the angle between the mandapam and the baseline, and you have the angle between the mandapam and this lower end, this angle as well. So you have two angles and one side. So when you, oh, it's through, because the theodolite is like a telescope. It's like a telescope, but it has these gradations. It has this, you can use the theodolite along with like, like there's a scale to measure your angles, and that scale also has a vernier, so you can get a precise thing. So that's how you would get the angle, right? Is that clear then? Okay.
During that time, there is this huge fascination with like mapping everything, and some people don't want it to happen. What exactly is it about? Like, like people are trying to climb the Everest, and like I don't know what's the mystery about. Why are people stopping them, and why are they so bent upon mapping it, surveying it? What exactly is there?
Why would you want to draw a map first? You're the colonizer. You need to know exactly how much land you have. So remember I said that they didn't even know the distance between Madras and Bangalore. So in like this is sort of like this was thought to be a basic thing that you need before you can actually, for instance, figure out how much of land is under you. Therefore, how much of tax can you charge, right? So the British were doing these three different surveys at the same time. So one was this trigonometrical survey. One was like a survey by a gentleman named Buchanan, who was basically walking around in what is now Karnataka and some parts of Andhra and documenting things that he came across. Like, for instance, he'd go to Bangalore or he'd go to Madikeri and he'd find out like what is in the market, what are they eating, what is the price, what is the process. So this was one kind of survey that was being done. And there was a topographical survey that was being done by a third gentleman almost at the same time. So all of these were really for them to understand the land which they were now gradually occupying and ruling, right? That was the basic purpose, to understand. So this was one reason why they wanted to draw maps. Nobody was climbing Everest at that time. That was not the point. That was a pure scientific curiosity. Which is the highest mountain in the world? We don't know. That's all. But the purpose of the maps was to just know what is there. Exactly. All of that. So let me build on this map thing a little bit more. What was the relevance of the GTS? Okay. Did they figure out the shape of the Earth? Yes, they did. There is a term called the Everest spheroid, which was like, what's a spheroid? A spheroid is, if you imagine, like the egg, right? The egg has the longer axis and the shorter axis. So if you know the long axis and the short axis, you can determine the exact shape of that egg. So based on the GTS, Everest came up with a number which is called the Everest spheroid. And all our maps in India were actually based on that Everest spheroid. So yes, when they started to make the maps initially, it was like Sir said, to know, to determine your military maneuvers, all of this was required. But even today, like until about the late 1990s, Everest spheroid was the basis for all our maps in India. Not just India, even in Southeast Asia. Yeah, the perambulators weren't really all that exact, and usually they were like limited to the roads and the routes that were already being used, which meant that large other parts were not there. So yeah, like a route survey. Yeah. Thank you so much.